Hello and welcome to this episode of Beat Teacher Burnout. I'm Rowena Hicks, your host, and today we're going to talk about going from police cars to pygmy goats. We're going to look at staff training, staff empowering, how you can invest in your staff, particularly in a PRU setting actually. What happens when you do that? When children are challenging, and then the impact on the children. So I'm joined today by Anthony. Hi, Anthony. It's great to have you on here with us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So you have just got an amazing story of where you have started teaching and where you are now. So why don't you share that with everybody to start with?
Okay, so I've been a teacher for 27 years. I think it's probably taken me 27 years to admit that I came into teaching to change the world. I was an English teacher, but I didn't come in to shout at children, and I have shouted at loads and loads of children. And I didn't come in to teaching to teach them about Shakespeare and things like that. I really believed that the young people are our future, and we've got to get it right with them. So I was a reluctant teacher. My mum was a teacher, and she always said, get inside the system and change it. But I really didn't, and still don't like the education system. I don't like the testing, and I don't like the kind of Victorian nature of it all. But she said, like I've just said, she said, if you don't like something, either put up with it or get inside it and change it. So I guess I've spent 27 years getting inside it and changing it. I was mainstream for 23 years, and I've always worked with the disaffected and the disadvantaged. As a choice, I worked in a leafy suburb for about 3 years, but it just wasn't for me. I liked what I wouldn't call now, but for ease of this, what we might call the naughty children, and they seemed to like me. And I guess I made a career out of it. So I was an English teacher, then a head of English, then an assistant head, and then I was a deputy head responsible for curriculum and standards. And then I became a head teacher, and then I had an epiphany, I suppose. So I think back in those days, I'd taken on a really, really challenging school in East Manchester. And I believed that if you get the behaviour right, then that's when you can really start changing things. The leadership above me believes that if you got the teaching and learning right, you could really start changing things. And we had a bit of a clash there. So I had to rethink what I wanted to do from a professional point of view. I had a behaviour system at that point that I'm not proud of, but I was very proud of then, which was a bit more zero tolerance. Because I used to think if you cut off a finger to save the hand, then that's the way to move forward. So, we had quite a zero tolerance, a C1, C2, C3 kind of system, but we made massive impact on short-term behaviour improvements back in that day. And I thought I'd done it all, and I thought I was a wizard at that kind of stuff. I left mainstream education. I became a consultant for a little bit. As I said to you, my passion really was with the disaffected and the disadvantaged. And I think I'd seen too many children getting quite heavy prison sentences. And one boy springs to mind in particular, who in year 11 came out of our internal AP and back into mainstream. And he was okay in my classroom, and he was brilliant in my office. I could get him sharpening pencils or sorting my folders out and all of that stuff. But ultimately, his literacy was probably that of a primary school child, and probably his numeracy as well. And he left school with no GCSEs, went to FE. I guess he was born on a vocational pathway. He'd have been a great mechanic or a bricklayer or builder. But he needed his maths and English, which he didn't get. So by Christmas, it dropped out of FE. And within a year, he'd fallen in with a drug dealer who had sent him and 3 boys to collect a debt, and they'd ended up murdering somebody. And I just thought then, he's 18 years old. The other people he was with were roughly the same age. 1 boy is dead. 3 other boys have lost their lives. And ultimately, we failed because surely, like I said, if our job is to change the world, we haven't changed his world as teachers at all. So ultimately I thought, I've got to wear my heart on my sleeve here. That means that I need to get into that kind of PRU setting and try and work with those kind of children. It's quite expensive to set up your own PRU. A colleague and I were going to do that. And I also felt that the buildings that PRUs are often in are the shabby and forgotten buildings that nobody else wants, which kind of reflects how lots of people view those children. And so we were struggling to find somewhere. It's quite expensive to set up your own PRU. And then a PRU came up in Tameside. And this is about 5 years ago now. And I suppose it was one of those jobs where when you go for the interview, I didn't care at that point, as in I wasn't trying to impress anybody. I wasn't trying to tell them what they wanted to hear. I had this idea that if you love the children, not in a weird way, and if you care for them and clothe them and feed them, that maybe we could start making that difference. And I got that job because you always get those kind of jobs. And so I got that job. And then on my first day after appointment, I was in one of the offices and I looked out the window and there were 3 police vans. There was a year 10 boy and he was being sectioned. He was assaulting his dad and the police were assaulting him. And I kind of had one of those oh dear moments where I thought, this is a bit more than I bargained for. And then I walked into the main body of the building and the children were causing £80,000 worth of damage a year by kicking doors through. And I kind of thought, have I committed career suicide because I can't go back to mainstream and I'm not sure I know how to run a PRU. These heady ideas I had, I'm not sure they're going to cut it. I reached out to other PRU heads and other special school heads, and they were talking this language of trauma and attachment. And I say, I fell down a trauma and attachment rabbit hole, but it's changed my life. It changed how I parent. It's changed how I behave in my own relationship. And it's absolutely changed how I run my school and now how I run my multi-academy trust. And I think I've become a bit evangelical about it. I think I can't understand why we didn't know this as teachers. And I think everybody needs to know. And I'm on a bit of a mission now to tell everybody and anybody about some of this stuff that I've learned along the way and about how we can maybe change things. So that's how I ended up in the PRU setting. Is that, will that do for that?
Well, that's a story that we haven't had on this podcast before. And that's where I got the introduction of the police cars at the start, because I know you tell me now what you have in your PRU is not the police cars, but it is the pygmy goats. So do you want to explain how you run your settings? Because I know you've got more than one now, in a way that enables the pupils, but also the staff to be the best that they can be.
I mean, we call it now relational inclusion. And we call it relational inclusion because if you call it trauma and attachment, I think that's really difficult for teaching and support staff because we're not therapists and we're not counsellors and we're starting to sway into a world where we don't understand that. And also in the 5 years that I've done this, the research has changed. So they used to talk about a triune brain where you had basically a lizard brain and a mammal brain and an extended brain. And that's been disproved now, and now it's an adaptive brain. So what I didn't want was a label that was suddenly going to become out of date and then useless anymore. However, if we call it relational, I think any work that you do, but definitely if you're working with children and young people, it's all about the relationships. And if you, and even with your staff and with any other adults, if you get the relationships right, everything else works. And then also it was looking at this idea of inclusion. And I know it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment. And, if you say to any school, are you inclusive? I don't think there's a school in the country that would say, no, we're not. But the reality is, do we really know what inclusion is? Is there a definition for that? And inclusion doesn't just mean not excluding. It means how has everybody got a seat at the table where they can be heard and they can be seen. So I think starting off, it was having something to call this that makes it clear for everybody else. And then we've got 5 guiding principles that goes underneath that, which maybe we'll come to and maybe we won't. But it was then looking at, in a PRU, these children didn't survive in a mainstream school for whatever reason. I say they've been failed by school, but maybe that's my thing. They are children. And so if it didn't work in school, I was faced with a position where I had 130 children who'd been permanently excluded. So what do we do with them? They're in my building and we can either treat them like animals and they will behave like animals, or we can do something differently with them. So, when you look at the trauma and the attachment, what we're starting to learn about is the brain and how the brain works and how our behaviours work as a response to that brain. So I guess what we put together was a training package which looked at ACEs, which are your adverse childhood experiences, and then the nervous system, and then hyper and hypovigilance, and then attachment. And I think once you do that, I call it the matrix moment, because then instead of seeing a naughty child, you see a child responding to a very difficult world. And I think what I then uncovered was that the children actually weren't the problem. That in a lot of the cases, it's the staff that's the problem. And I'm a teacher, so I'm not criticizing teachers. I mean that we're in this ridiculous world where you've got 30 children sitting in front of you who probably don't want to be there. There's all sorts that's gone on in their lives. There's all sorts that's gone on in the staff's lives. And you've got this kidology. If those children decide, if you've got a school of 1,000 and they all actually stood up and said, we're not doing this, there isn't very much you could do about it. So there's this kidology. And unfortunately, our system's largely built on a Victorian education system, which was an old factory system, and it hasn't adapted with the times. And I think, so we've got this clash of this idea that you need to sit down and you need to shut up, and that way you will learn. But when you learn about the science and think, well, if they're coming from a very violent family background, or just they're starving, or just they're very tired, well, they're not. It doesn't matter how much you shout at them and how much you threaten them, they're not going to be able to learn. So our training started to look at what was going on with the brain, how the brain developed, and how we could better meet that need. Because I believe that if you instead of spending 5 minutes or 10 minutes every morning shouting at children in assemblies, and don't get me wrong, I've done that. And like I said, I've shouted at thousands of children, and I've got them quiet as well. I've got a really loud voice. But instead of doing that, if you spent 4 weeks working on this, you don't have to shout at them after that. So it's that which way we use our time. And I suppose, I think I said it was the staff. So the staff didn't know this. They didn't know that. And so we put some training in place for our staff. And we were fortunate in the Peru that every Friday we've got CPD Friday in the afternoon. So we've got a couple of hours training. Although equally, Friday afternoon's not the best time to train anybody. But I'll take, a couple of hours every week. And we committed to working with our staff at least every half term, but probably about every 4 weeks. We provided some kind of trauma and attachment training. And I think it started with, when you're in mainstream, you know how a week before half term, everybody's looking a bit red-faced and everybody's looking a bit tired and everybody's temper's a little bit short. And in the Peru, that's magnified even more. And I think it's sort of 2 weeks before half term, and the staff were looking really red-faced and the kids were really anxious. And I learned about vicarious trauma, which is obviously if you work in a highly pressured environment with people that are struggling or suffering, then over time that starts to rub off on you. And I can remember presenting to the staff and just explaining this to them. And they sort of, when I said that to them, they went, oh. You could see, because we carry a lot of blame as teachers and school leaders ourselves, and a lot of this work, if we had 4 hours to talk about it, we'd go into blame and shame, I think. But there's a lot of blame, and I think just by saying to staff, it's not your fault, we're all feeling like that, and actually there's a scientific proven reason why you're feeling like that, then that's a start. But then equally, it's what you do about that, because it's no good just telling people. And I think the other thing then that we looked at were ACEs and trauma and attachment, because again, what we found in the Peru environment, in my Peru, roughly 80% of the staff 80% of the staff had 4 or more ACEs and didn't know why that might be important. And I think we put then a package of training into, so that, and you've got to be very sensitive about that. And it isn't about saying you can or you can't, or you should or you shouldn't. It's raising awareness to say, do you know what this is? Do you know how that might have an impact? And do we know what we could do to support people to stop that having that impact? Because they say 4 ACEs or more isn't a death sentence. It's a warning that potentially, if you don't take note of that, that could be really, really harmful. So how do we protect people? And then equally, 80% of the staff in the Peru were medicated, by a doctor. And again, so what I had in the Peru was a lot of dysregulation that we didn't even know. And people were probably scared. They didn't know. and wouldn't have felt comfortable being honest about that, but then didn't recognise that that might have an impact on the day ahead. So you had dysregulated staff meeting dysregulated students and then wondering why by 10 o'clock in the morning everything had blown up. So it was creating a safe space where it's okay to not be okay, but making sure then that we put something in place to support those staff. And I suppose one thing I didn't talk to you about on our pre-conversation was about the staff check-in. Would that be something useful maybe to share?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
you know, and every idea is always, I stole this from somewhere. I don't think I've had an original idea in my life. You know, you just take them from other people. But what we now do as a staff is we have a check-in every morning, and we start with groups of no more than 10. We used to stand in a circle, and some groups like that and some groups don't. And we have three activities, if you like. The first one is a question, and it's just an icebreaker. So, you know, I don't know, if you were a car, what kind of car would you be? You know, ketchup or brown sauce, whatever it is. And we go around the circle and everybody answers their part. And don't get me wrong, when I first went to see this, I said to the head teacher, I don't believe you do this and I don't believe it works. But it does, you know, and it can work. And some people find it difficult, but I think it makes a big impact. Because the second thing then that we do is, and we've done this two ways, we then ask people how they are, how they're feeling. Now, the one I went to see, they did just say, how are you feeling this morning? Everybody went round and said, I'm good, I'm not so good. In the Peru, we found that a bit more challenging because I wasn't really trying to work out how people were saying, I don't want to share how I'm feeling. That's not really your business. And it isn't really what I was asking. What I wanted to know was how dysregulated they were or where their window of tolerance was. And I think that is my business, and I think that is necessary. So we've created a 9-point scale, you know, where, and it's color coded. So it goes from red to yellow to green. And 1 is very dysregulated. And green, number 9, is the most open window of tolerance. And I'm feeling fantastic. And the reason we wanted to do that was to get a real temperature check first thing in the morning, because it wasn't, again, it's not about blame and shame, but if somebody's coming in, you all know when you've had those bad mornings, if somebody's coming in and they've had a really bad morning and we're not doing anything about it, then your nervous system will, your window of tolerance is narrowed, you will explode, and then all sorts of things ricochet off that. So it was a matter of finding a way of identifying that and then making sure we do something about it. And then the last thing is we do some breathing. So one of the teachers is a yoga teacher, so they did some yoga poses, but sometimes it was just some measured breathing. You know, there's you breathe in and out on you as you just that kind. So every morning starts like that. In 2 or 3 of our schools, they then mirror that with the children. So when they come in at form time, they do that as well. But it's about setting your start to the day, isn't it? Because if you're calming everybody's nervous system at the start of the day, that can have a big impact on what the rest of the day sort of pans out like.
Okay, so I mean, I love that. I've never worked anywhere that does anything like that. Anthony, what do you do if you have some staff who are very low and quite coming in quite dysregulated if they've had just a terrible night or morning? What,
I mean, you
how would you
know,
action that?
and so again, you know, generally it's 1 or 2 members of, you know, what you tend to come from with that is there are some people with long-term issues. And what it means is that we know that and that there's a safe space. And sometimes just saying to somebody, how are you feeling? Separately just going out, I know it's tough, but that's enough, you know? And sometimes it was a matter of, do you know what? Let's just pull you out. Somebody will cover your class. Let's give you a cup of tea. Just normal human stuff where we could just settle it and listen to somebody. For one example, and you know, I mentioned we've written a book, and it is in the book, but I'll tell this example if that's all right. Where a member of staff had driven to school, and I'm sure she won't mind me telling it. Well, it's in the book, so she definitely won't mind. She was driving to school, and somebody cut her up, and so she pulled in next to them, and oh no, sorry, she was driving to school. Yeah, they did. She then put one of her fingers up in the window, and I think they then tried to slam on in front of her. So she came into the building and she was shaking. You know, I think she was a little bit ashamed, possibly, or embarrassed that she'd done that. And definitely her, you know, she was in that fight or flight mode, but it gave her a space for us to go, right, we know that's happened. We can sit you down. You can have 10, 15, 20 minutes. Let's just have you calm, have a brew, and then we can start your day again. Whereas if she hadn't had that space to talk to anybody about it, then ultimately you end up taking that out on the class, don't you? You know, whether you mean it or not, that's your nervous system response.
Do you know, Anthony, I love that. I mean, we will talk about your book in a moment because it's an important book. I just want to say that from my perspective of what I teach, and I guess the book that I first wrote is talking about until you know that you're valued and you have value to the place, well, intrinsic value is very important, but to know that you're seen, heard, and valued by those around you at school has a huge impact, which is why I love what you're doing with your 9 point scale every morning. But the interesting thing is that what you do to follow up on that with people who, who have a low score is not rocket science. It's actually just seeing, hearing, and valuing them. It doesn't cost a lot, but the impact of that on someone's day and their class of children is going to be enormous,
And
right?
I think, you know, and I think that's, and all of these strategies, they don't cost anything. And I think that the kickback sometimes is, but it takes time. And I think what you've got to understand, which is what you've alluded to, is if you don't take that time, it costs you more time later because, I don't know, a child does something and then they get told off and then somebody else has to go to the room and then they have to get removed and then all of that.
Mhm.
And we don't see that, but a lot of this stuff, if you try, and I think a lot of our strategies are preemptive. Let's work out what might be the problem and stop it happening, rather than being reactive and firefighting all the time. And you know, if you come back, we were talking about what the Prue's like now, and I think I said they were causing £80,000 worth of damage. There were police there all the time, and now we've got pygmy goats that roam free, and we've got chickens, and we've got ducks, and we've got guinea pigs, we've got reptiles, we've got a forest school, and you know, this is a Prue, and there is a fire, a controlled fire, not ones that the children have set, burning all the time. The children are toasting food and all that kind of stuff, and they collect fresh eggs every morning. You know, that's the environment that we've created
Yeah.
that kind of
So
reflects
it's a
our ethos
massive,
and culture.
yeah. So a massive turnaround. So I know your book's just come out. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to buy it today. But you've been telling me that this has the story of the development of this, right?
Yeah, so there's loads of books that you can buy by far more intelligent and sciencey people than me. And what we wanted to do was write a book for parents and for teachers and for school leaders. So what it does is it tells our story. It talks about, first of all, everything that we've got wrong, and then secondly, history of learning some of this stuff in the classroom, and then some of the science that goes with it and where the evidence base is. And then I guess more importantly, some strategies that you can then take away and use. And each chapter ends with a reflection, which is a kind of, have you thought about this? And what about if you did this? And then some signposts into what you might do next.
I love that. What I might have to invite you back on so that I can ask all the questions I've got after I've read your book, if that's okay. So, what's the book called and where do people find it?
So it's called Educating Everyone, an Introduction to Relational Inclusion in Schools. I would hold it up, but it's all backwards, so I don't think that'll. I will hold it up because it's quite a distinct cover.
Yeah,
And
with
you
the
can,
handprints on it. Yeah.
yeah, and the hands represent, you see, they represent the school and the child and the community stroke family, and they're in the zones of regulation. So we thought quite carefully about what that design came from. You can buy it everywhere. So you can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it at Routledge, any good bookshop, you can buy it.
Okay.
And there is a book study going on actually. So if you follow me through LinkedIn, we've done the first 4 chapters. There are book studies, and you can pick them up on YouTube if you want to hear me and Alan, who's the co-author, talking about where the ideas came from.
Okay, fantastic. We'll put a link to the book in the blurb for the podcast as well, Anthony. So I'm really grateful. I love the fact that we've talked about police cars and pygmy goats in one episode and all the stuff in between. Thank you for being vulnerable and honest in your journey and the highs and lows, because I think other both teachers and leaders are going to take a lot from today. So I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you took something of value from today. If you want to connect, I'm at rowenahicks.com, or I have a Facebook group, which is Preventing Teacher Burnout. So I look forward to connecting to you at one of those.